So one thing that separates the Ford F-150 from the Chevy Silverado is all the different trim packages. Chevys are typically more sportier, youthful design, where F-150 has like old school models like the King Ranch that you see here. And I've sold both versions. I would say the F-150 is definitely more of an old school. Before the famous pushrod engines of the 1950s, Ford and Chevy were doing two completely different things. Ford had the famous flathead engine for about 21 years, and Chevy had the Stovebolt 6. So they're doing two completely different things. Then Ford switches to the Y block because General Motors had all these great V8 engines, pushrod engines that were more modern. So they quickly came out with the Y block. Now, how to identify the two is totally different. Ford started coming out with more engine families because Chevy had five different brands all developing their own engines in-house. So they each had their own V8 engine department. So Ford, after the Ford Edsel did not succeed, they decided to put their focus into engine families. So they went from, for example, the Y block to the Ford Edsel engines, to the Windsor engines, to the Cleveland engines. They had the 385 big block. They eventually went to the modular engines, where Chevy sort of consolidated all their engines. They eventually went to the corporate engines, and Chevy engines are typically referred to just as small blocks and the number of the cubic inch displacement. So, for example, Ford, you would say this vehicle has an FE engine or a Cleveland engine or a small block Windsor engine, where Chevy, you just might say 350 small block or 427 big block. They don't really use engine families and talk about the factories as much, where Ford references the Ford factories. Two most important topics regarding Ford V8 engines and Chevy V8 engines, and we're going to be talking about blocks. So we're going to be talking about Ford and why they didn't really use the terms big block and small block, and why the Chevy small block was so popular. So let's start with Ford first. Now, the most popular vehicle besides the Ford Mustang would be the Ford Thunderbird, and the reason the Thunderbird is so important is from the invention of the Ford Y block, which was the first engine after the famous Ford Flathead. You can really see the evolution of the pushrod engines based on just the Thunderbird and the evolution of Ford V8 engines. Now, Ford uses engine families. So they don't use blocks necessarily, even though you could categorize them as big block or small block. Ford people just don't discuss it in those terms. So they would say, I drive a Cleveland, or I drive a Lima, or I have a modular engine, or I have a 390 FE engine. They have engine families. That's the biggest difference. So like a Windsor small block was the longest running and is still produced today, which is the Windsor, Ontario plant started out with pushrod engines. Then they went to single overhead cam. Now they use the Coyote,